Hello, everyone. On behalf of the Doing Sociology team, we welcome you all to this particular interview where we will be talking to Professor Bandana Purkayastha, who is Professor of Sociology and Asian American Studies at the University of Connecticut. And today, Rituparna and I will be interviewing her on her work. Her research interests include human rights security, migration and migrants, intersectionality and violence. Her works on ethnicity, racism, gender, violence, and peace have been published extensively and in different parts, in different countries. She currently serves in the executive committee of the International Sociological Association. She was awarded the American Sociological Association and Asian American Section's contributions to the field Career Award in 2016. The University of Connecticut College of Liberal Arts and Sciences Research Excellence Award in 2019. She is American Sociological Association's Jessie Bernard Award co-winner for 2019. Welcome, ma'am. We're extremely glad that we are being able to interview today, and thank you for agreeing to do this with us.
Well, thank you for inviting me, Rituparna and Deepali, and also thanks to Professor Moitri Chaudhary for first launching this idea with me. I think y'all are doing something very exciting, and I also look forward to listening to your, not just listening, viewing all the recordings that you're doing over time in this series on doing sociology. So with that, let's get started.
Okay, thank you so much, ma'am, for the kind words. To sort of begin with, you have worked on a wide range of issues, but what perhaps sort of anchors all of them is a careful and productive use of the intersectional analytical framework. Now, it's a term that has been widely used today and across disciplines. It's very much in demand, but often there is also a lack of clarity. It becomes more of a buzzword in that sense, rather than the powerful analytical framework that it is. So we would actually like to know from you about the context within which it arose and the manner that it got deployed. Then how exactly have you used it? This is a three-part question. And what do you think, how useful is intersectionality as a conceptual tool or an analytical framework in sociological research?
Thank you for that question. So I'm going to start about the context in which the talk about intersectionality arose. And later on, if I can talk more about why intersectionality has remained a buzzword, but let me make that my second topic. So I'm going to focus primarily on the US. I'm very much aware that people were writing and describing social phenomena from the perspective of intersectionality without actually using this word. And you have a very long lineage of that in India, like literally centuries long lineage of that in India. And you certainly have it in other parts of the world as well. So my intention in just highlighting some of the key moments in the US is not to shore up US hegemony one more time in this matter of knowledge production, but to point out in some ways that this specific term, not actually the structures of race, class, caste, religion, sexuality, age, not those structures, because those structures were being talked about and how they intersect with each other in many parts of the world, but the term itself, intersectionality, kind of came out of a particular moment, I think, within American academia. Now, I mean, again, in the US also, there are various people who were writing about it, but the point at which it became a term, I think, was in 1991 when Kimberly Crenshaw actually wrote her famous article, Mapping the Margins. And Kimberly Crenshaw is a legal scholar, but the term kind of made its way through the growing power of women and gender studies to become a part of our lexicon. Within sociology, I would say, and once again, there were people who were writing about the intersections before, but intersectionality became this concept that people could not actually ignore once Patricia Hill Collins's Black feminist thought and her subsequent writings on intersectionality began to be read very widely. Now, the precursor to this is, again, within sociology and within the US, we've had centuries of white males write about all kinds of things. It wasn't like Black males weren't writing either, but the dominant power was the writing of white males. And the growing feminism created a kind of revolution and challenge within sociology. I mean, it's astonishing to think that I have a colleague who retired maybe 7 years ago, who was among the women who actually stormed into an American Sociological Conference executive committee meeting, which consisted all of males, to say, why is it that the power structure never, ever makes it possible for women to join? So this in some ways is a recent history. All of this happened towards the end of the 60s, early 1970s. And so for about 2 decades, the challenge was to even get women adequately framed within sociological theories. That is, not paper over the fact that women's experiences are indeed different because they're subject to structures that are somewhat different from the structures that males in general experience. But the issue was that it wasn't enough to just talk about males and females in general. You couldn't, for example, if you look at the work of Black feminists, explain why Black males were doing so much worse than white females. I mean, you have to consider race at that point, right? And then you have to begin to consider that within the US, as affirmative action, began to wend its way through various corporations and even the universities. Why was it that people were more likely to prefer African-American females to African-American males? Well, it was because they were trying to hit 2 deficits. So that is, they had few females, they certainly didn't have people of color. So in that mix, they'd go and hire more African-American females than males. This didn't mean they actually worked towards equity by any means, but even if they hired 1 or 2 people, that's the way the deficit was going. So intersectionality, which really talks about intersecting structures of class and racism and gendering, arises within that framework. And then since the 1990s, we have been in many ways trying to figure out, is it enough to only look at those 3 structures? Certainly, and I'll come back to this again, like if you look internationally, is it sufficient to just think about racism structures? Or do you also think about ethnicities, which perhaps would be more pertinent, for example, to a country like Kenya, right? But then does racism go away? Do we, or have we been able to capture issues of sexuality when we talk about gender? And you know the answer to that now people are far more apt to talk about race, class, gender, sexuality. Should we ignore the structures of age? Some people acknowledge it, most still don't, right? My own issue that I've been reflecting on recently has been about religion, but I'll hold off on that. And then where we are right now, having moved this long distance from Patricia Hill Collins's work through the work of various other scholars of color, is to a point where we are also really seriously thinking about methodological nationalism within the ways in which we think of these structures. And then if we do that, how do we not only look at the power embedded in how we think of, for example, racism or gender or anything else, or the ways in which these structures intersect. The question is, can we think in terms of transnational lives as well? And if we do, what does that mean? So this is kind of a lineage in which intersectionality has proceeded here. So I'll stop right here in terms of the lineage. If you want me to talk about, how I've used it, I can give you a brief overview of that as well. I touched on, the issues of transnational context that I'm interested in, and I'm also more recently interested in the issues of how religion works, as part of these intersections. But I've mostly applied this to to studying migrants, for example, studying human rights and studying violence. So those are the three broad areas. And then within that, there are all kinds of topics that I have looked at where I have tried to, with colleagues very frequently, look at this question of intersectionality and apply it more effectively. So that was a long answer to your question.
So in your works on migration and migrants, you have used intersectional approach to study this migrant security. So now in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, do you think this approach can be used to understand the migrant crisis which is there in India at the moment?
Oh, 100%, not simply in India, really around the world. So if you take just the pandemic crisis and just stand back as sociologists and look at what are the largest structural factors that we're looking at. We are certainly looking at larger factors that have to do with class positioning. We are certainly looking at larger factors that have to do with structures of racism, or in the case of India, structures of caste, as well as structures, especially growing structures of creating distinctions between religion. These are very evident around India for sure, but along with that, certainly gender. And I'm going to just talk about those three structures as intersecting structures to keep it simple first. So what we're seeing, if you look at India, and this is based on my reading multiple newspapers, is we are seeing a great deal of people's dispossessions. We are seeing further marginalization. We are seeing a kind of shift in political contexts, where on the one hand, this crisis, like the crises of war and so on, kind of push people to give up a lot of rights, of privacy, and so on and so forth, because the government has to manage this system. But at the same time, when those powers expand onto other areas, it's not in the news, it's not what people are thinking about. And so what else happens to society in terms of what kind of democratic demands can people make? These are questions that kind of get subverted and certainly submerged. If you look at, for example, the pictures that constantly come out in, or have been coming out for a while in the Indian newspapers, you see streams and streams and streams of younger male migrants, right? They're either congregating in bus termini, trying to get onto buses, or people are walking. And even when you see pictures of people walking, if it's an entire family walking, it's often the person most prominently featured is the father or the male. Now, As a matter of fact, the COVID crisis has hit the female workers in a terrible way. Many of these female migrants are usually the kind of women who travel by train on an everyday basis and come and provide care work within people's homes. They're not really part of those visual images when you look at migrants, and they are not because what they do has gotten normalized. That this is what normal life is like. They wake up at 3:30 in the morning, they get on a train, they come to a city, they work, they take another train, they go back home, and they put in their second and third shifts. Actually, in Chennai, they've recently put out some really excellent reports written from an intersectional perspective, because there are class, caste, gender, and sometimes religious structures involved with just what is happening in terms of people losing jobs, people being able to go back and find jobs, people being able to make demands on the government that under the system of COVID, we are still workers, even though we don't look like we work at all. Unlike the male migrants, who are also in an enormous crisis. Again, I'm talking about the kind of men who are trying, have been trying to make their way back to their homes. Nobody has ever questioned that they are workers. That has never been a question. Whereas when it becomes this segregated kind of workforce and the female workforce, you see different, what can I say, indifference because of non-recognition of their work, non-recognition of their identity as workers, and this idea that the home is where the female workers normally belong. So the government and the rest of society doesn't actually have too much of an obligation to look to what their needs are under these crises. And the needs of many of these women are related to their class, caste, and gender, constructed social locations. So whether or not they can alternatively farm, I'm talking about West Bengal now, a lot of the women come from nearer the Sundarban areas, and there's been some chatter about, well, maybe all of them have farms. No, they don't. They're often daily laborers. They gave up that daily laborer job to come to the city to do some kind of work. So what I'm saying is, in terms of the COVID crisis, your analysis can only be a robust analysis if you are, one, asking people about their experiences, and you're analyzing both the contemporary situation and the history of what led up to it. Like, why are there so many young men working in so many cities where if a crisis hits, they have no homes, they have no jobs, they have no political rights to make demand on the states to which they have contributed their labor? So intersectionality becomes critical there. And also when we're talking about migrant men walking back, for example, what about their safety and vulnerability to violence? What about their ability to access food, in various villages when they walk back? There is also this thing, and I think it's partially true. There have been villages in some places, where they have said, okay, we'll share whatever we have to eat. But is that being segregated on the basis of caste and religion? These are questions that nobody is asking. But if we wish to know, and we wish to know robustly as social scientists, so we know that if this continues or something like this hits again, we have better preparedness. We should have asked these questions. We should have found out what is going on, and we should be better prepared for it. Just subsuming them under the category of poor migrants does not actually capture the whole gamut of what people are going through. What happens when they end up back home, and what's going to happen in, let's say, a couple of years? in terms of jobs, in terms of their positioning, in terms of everything. Politically, socially, economically, culturally, what are the outcomes going to be? I think intersectionality is perhaps the only more sophisticated set of analytical framework that we have that at least alerts us to look and alerts us to ask a few more questions. So I'll kind of stop there, but anything that wasn't clear, ask me.
I think it was very clear. So you were talking about how, you know, female migrants become invisible from media portrayal. This is in the context of India. Similarly, if you look at the US experience, when there is a lot of talk about rape, a sort of invisible framework engulfs victims or survivors of women of color. So how can we explain that, you know, and can an intersectional framework be used to understand that?
So in order to understand, you know, violence in general and issues of rape and how they're both recognized, understood, and addressed. Let's say I'm going to start with the US. It's actually broadly the same answer. Like, based on what histories and social practices have we normalized certain violence? In other words, if a rape happens, it's usually the white middle-class woman's rape that will make the headline news because it's seen as such an outrage. Then it becomes about womanhood. On the other hand, I mean, in the US, centuries of rape of enslaved people of all kinds, centuries of rape ongoing, for example, of Native Americans, where the women, people will come into the reservation, rape women, leave, understanding the arms of the law won't follow them out because the rape happened within the Native American territories. Rape, violence, sexual harassment, and I'm using sexual harassment to rape because the legal definitions of what becomes rape kind of varies very specifically across countries and states. But when these kinds of violence happen, if we are already conditioned by our history, and because it happens so frequently, to take certain things as normal, there's not going to be that much of an outrage. Because who's going to write and make it front page news unless you have organized groups pushing that? Whereas in the US, people still talk about the Central Park jogger who was supposedly raped and killed by these 9 young men, which later on turned out to be a false accusation against those people. And the Central Park jogger, because she was white, she was young, and she, you know, and well-to-do, jogging, very much a middle-class activity. So what I'm saying is, what intersectionality allows us to look at are different constellations of privileges and marginalizations. And a huge part of how people are marginalized is both the ideologies, the practices, and the institutional arrangements, all three of those, that actually erase or normalize their experience. And both of those are like enormous violations of their human dignity at the very least. But to the extent the rest of us are not outraged, the rest of us feel it's not about us, the rest of us think that, oh, there must have been something wrong with those people, then it becomes entirely okay. You go back to this question of all the women who work within households, typically lower class, very often lower caste as well. In India and here, it's definitely lower class women, often immigrants of color. Actually, I think if people get raped while they are, working within households, Right now, there are somewhat stronger measures to complain about that. I'm not saying it's perfect, I'm just saying relatively stronger measures. But I was actually thinking in not only in India, but because we were recently writing this book on human trafficking and labor trafficking and so on. And one of the things that we found was that a lot of women who go to other countries to work in people's homes, often because of their vulnerable political positions, are also sexually harassed and sometimes raped within those households. After a point, there are cases of those women just saying, I might as well go and join this, the prostitution industry. If my body is being violated, I'll get money, and money that I can send back home. It's a make you sick to your stomach kind of situation. But what I am saying is we put up with it because we don't wish to know it. Or if we know it, we can come up with excuses to kind of protect the perpetrators and blame the women. So all of those factors lead to this heightened, what can I say, this heightened amount of support and, just outrage. If a woman whose race, class, caste, gender, sexuality privileges her, as opposed to the ones who are less privileged and on balance, very marginalized on all of those factors. And if they are in that very, very marginalized position, it is as though it doesn't matter because we are, after all, benefiting from those same privileges, and their plight, their hurt, their outraged dignity kind of has no space in these intersecting structures of which we are all about.
Ma'am, you've been talking about the intersectional framework and tried to understand why experiences of rape differ for certain women. Now, do you think the framework can also be used to understand transnational experiences? In your own work, you speak about how global North voices and materializations have actually been predominant in shaping and circulating the notion of Indian rape culture, while India-based voices in all their diversity are sort of marginalized. In one of your articles, you argue that Indian rape culture is used as an allegory for power-laden transnational and colonialist constructions of knowledge more generally. Could you elaborate on this?
Absolutely. And in fact, I'm happy to do so because as Roshali Patil and I, when we did that work, there are parts of it that I did in India, and I also want to talk about the specificities of how this hegemony works. So this idea of Indian rape culture, it's an old colonial construction. That's how the British missionaries back and forth justified to the world why they were in India, depending on which exact point of their years in India. People were raising questions there, and they typically went back and said that Indian men are extremely violent towards Indian women, and these helpless victims of rape and savagery have to be protected, and India has to be civilized, and this is why they're there, right? And I think in that article, we talk a little bit about 1857 and so on and so forth. But anyway, that's an ideology that stays in circulation. But when we talk about transnationalism, what we try to explain there is that you have these historical traces of certain ideologies. Then the question becomes, who are the actors that can amplify these ideologies? And these actors are not necessarily talking to each other and conspiring. They're going their own way, but they are again taking what is normalized ideology for them, giving it a different shape, so that if you can think of a flood, and if you can think of multiple streams joining in a river, and the river then, brings down the spate of waters, that's something that happens. So what happens is, for example, the human rights organizations, right? They want to address violence against women, right? One of the ways in which they keep up that drumbeat, or why they want to do this, is by picking out the kind of discourse and ideologies that are normalized in the West. Let me make it really clear. I do not, under any circumstance, wish to say rapes don't happen and that there isn't violence against Indian women, like not for a single instance, because there are political ideologies that would construct it that way. This is not what this is about. What it's about very specifically is when Jyoti Singh was raped. So first it made the papers at a level that the rapes of lower caste, lower class, other, women of other religions never make the newspapers. I won't go into that right now. But even with something that is so mainstream, that, Times of India is, let's say, a paper that doesn't necessarily pay heed to what's happening in the regions, doesn't pay heed to diversities and so on. But even a paper like that was reporting on all of these protests around the country and what was happening and what was being said and so on. And whereas you have New York Times, which we also analyzed, and initially we were comparing the two newspapers, and New York Times, kind of the narrative was all about, Indian culture, Indian rape culture, violence against women, and then that rape gets normalized within that. So there is already a structure of knowledge into which this particular rape gets put. The human rights organizations, start a whole new push on, violence and rape of Indian women, again, drawing on those westernized discourses and those histories. As far as I know, most of the very prominent organizations within India who've been working against violence and against women and rape were not necessarily the people whose voices were being enhanced through the human rights organizations. You take any other media, you take all the blogs that were getting written, new grants that were being given to study India's rape culture. All of these come out of a logic that exists in the West, right? And so when we were talking about a transnational assemblage, that is exactly what we were talking about, that you have all these multiple actors, but those actors are drawing on their own histories, their own knowledge, their own discourses, and really not paying heed to what was being said on the ground or what was being demanded on the ground or what had been done for multiple decades on the ground, leading to significant erasures. And then here is the point that I want to make. We were actually doing Google searches to see which were the sources of the stories that were most prevalent and prominent. So when we were in the US, Vrushali teaches in Florida, I'm in Connecticut, we did these searches. It was clear it was the Western sources that come up on the first Google searches, right? And then that year I went to India. So we had decided I'd go to India. We actually didn't know this at that point, but now I'm aware of it. I went to India and I said, well, I'll do another search in India, kind of on the same topics at a different point of time, and see if there's any difference. And there was zero difference. And I was a little puzzled because why would it be that I kept seeing that same, almost 99.9% of the same sources even while I was sitting in India, I'd hope to get one or two. And then one of our friends who's a statistician pointed out, he said, "Are you using your own computer?" I'm like, "Yeah." And he said, "That's it. Because the way the search results are being given to you is based on this assumption that your IP address is a US IP address. So the knowledge that you're getting is already configured for a US audience." So I switched to an Indian computer because I actually was at JNU at that time, at the Institute for Advanced Studies. And this was the saddest part. I did get some of the Indian sources, but they were really just 4 or 5, mostly on page 2 or 3. So even the architecture of how you get information, whose voices get enhanced, is also co-created through the technologies and the algorithms that provide you with knowledge as you search. So when you think of transnationalism, which is really about what happens through countries, in some ways we are at a moment where we have constellations of actors from different countries trying to capture the hearts and minds and shape the knowledge of people in other countries. And so what platforms are they using, how they are doing that, become as important for understanding the structures of intersectionality. Or rather, we ought to be using intersectional frames to try and understand those knowledge structures transnationally if we want to understand this interplay between ideologies, our beliefs, and what we're going to act on. I mean, I could make a whole nother case of what's happening with WhatsApp, but I'll hold off on that. I just used Google as an example to talk to you about transnational influences that actually erase voices of people in multiple countries of the world.
So my next question to you is on your very specific take that you have on challenges of being a feminist within the Indian diaspora, and how does the intersectional and transnational framework allows us to understand the curious mix of ideologies which are often conflicting and that go into, you know, understanding the gender question among the Indian diaspora, particularly in the US?
So the issues in the Indian diaspora, you know, relating to gender and intersectionality have changed over time. Earlier, I came to the US in the 1980s, and in the 1980s, for example, it was a struggle, and I used to do a lot of work on violence against women. It was a struggle to actually get people to recognize that women were experiencing violence within homes. No, it was at that time we thought about it in gender terms only, having forgotten that a very specific migration history kind of selected more highly educated people to come to the US at that time. So the Indians we were talking about were all actually pretty white collar and professional occupations and so on. And the fact that there was, you know, violence against women amongst these households was somehow shaming their model image that they wanted to portray to the rest of America, that we might be brown-skinned, or, you know, we might be black or something, but, you know, we are models, we are not like those other racial minorities. So even dealing with violence against women brought us face to face with, you need to have an intersectional analysis. If a woman experiences violence, then what resources she has, what rights she has, whether that violence will be recognized by the rest of the diasporic community, are not simply issues of gender. They're issues of class, they're issues of race or racism structures, and so on. Later on, as Indians of various backgrounds began to migrate to the US, sometimes through families, there was a little bit more of a caste variation as well, certainly a little bit more about, excuse me, a little bit more religious variation as well. And those introduced new forms of, what was happening within the community. But suffice to say that there were these discriminations, and because the women were agitating about it, or the women who were agitating about it were often seen as somehow making too much of a very marginal problem. So that's something I experienced, right? On the other hand, as I wrote in EPW, I do live a privileged life, and that privileged life in many ways is really based on another gendered class aspect, and that is my husband. He also came here as a student, but he works in the corporate sphere. So I was definitely class privileged, right? By the time I got to academia, it was a different kind of a dynamic from an intersectional perspective, because like Margaret Abraham, we are women of color, but we are not African American. Our histories are not the same as those histories. We have a diaspora which is constantly talking about being a model minority publicly. So you are part of that community, and in some ways part of that privileged community, but you want to be part of the women of color politics. You have to figure out how to configure those social locations. There might be you as an individual trying to navigate a politics, but structurally you're in a different place. So these are some of the earlier, let's say, intersectional issues that came up. And apart from the fact as women, we all began with abysmal salaries. We had to fight through and, demand pay equity and all of those other things. Like none of that went away. We had to fight through and get them. But over time, the Indian community has become a major contributor financially and ideologically to some of the most conservative and authoritarian politics that are happening in India. And as that tide rises, we are clearly the outsiders to that tide of politics. Up to a certain point, I think Indian women and men, sections of Indian men and women, were very effective in challenging that politics. I think right now, much as I would like to say that we are very effective challengers, I don't think we are right now. So then, as part of these gendered politics in the diaspora, the question becomes, are we the knowledge makers? We might be educators, we might be people with PhDs, we might be people who actually know and study these things, but the knowledge is being made through WhatsApp bites. WhatsApp bites are being created both here and in India by people with a political agenda which symbolically upholds women, but a generalized vision of women, and absolutely erases caste, class, religion-based marginalization. So, thinking of my intersectional position in the diaspora, I'm certainly privileged in terms of, I'd say education, occupationally. There aren't that many, let's say, Indian women who are full professors in research one universities around the country. So I'm definitely privileged there. I know a lot of people as smart and brighter than I am who are in other institutions. So I have privileges there. But what I do not have a privilege about is my ability to speak authoritatively on subjects that I know about within the diasporic community, because that space has been taken over by other people, men and women, but who come at it from a different agenda. So again, that's a very long answer trying to explain how intersectionality allows me to understand this balance of privileges and marginalizations, and what, on the whole, what does it lead to in terms of social locations?
So the recent Black Lives Matter movement, we saw that it has resonated across, the world, including with people in India. And there are sections in India who would otherwise not care about or be undisturbed by violence inflicted on marginalized caste and communities. We've seen them also respond to the Black Lives Matter. So my question to you is, as a scholar who is familiar with both these worlds, what would you like to speak on this particularly, and also on questions of race and caste generally?
Yeah. Actually, I really want to thank you for that question, because it brings up a couple of issues that I should touch on and then specifically answer that question. That is, when I have been writing about intersectionality and transnationalism, looking at it, from the perspective of migrants, one of the things that I've been writing about is, because it's become more and more of a global and transnational world, we should not only think of intersectionality in terms of, okay, I'm marginalized or privileged or combinations of those in one country, right? So I might be more marginalized in terms of my color or what have you. Let's say in the US, I might be part of, let's say, the racial minority in the US. I might be part of the majority in another country, right? So that simultaneously we are able to participate both in the privileges of being a majority in one country and a minority, try to address a minority in another country. So recently we were doing some research with highly educated women and religion. And one of the things we found here, and this still leads to the answer to the question you asked, Deepali. One of the things we found is a lot of the women had voted for Hillary Clinton, and they absolutely passionately believed that, women should be president and they are Democrats and so on and so forth. As we kept talking, we found they really hated Muslims. They really thought that, the fact that Dalits organize here and they raise the issue of casteism, it was way back then, it does not exist. And many of these people feel like this political moment in India is great because it's showcasing India as great. And we had to try and figure out what was going on. Now stop and think of an intersectional analysis. These women, when they're in India, are racial minorities, and they face the full brunt of their, the gender structures, which also discriminate against them in many ways. So from that perspective, being part of the brigade that upholds gender equity or gender equality, or upholds the Democratic Party, which has more space for people of different colors, makes absolute sense. But they want to preserve their status in India as part of the majority. And part of maintaining that status as part of the majority includes saying that, well, casteism, religious discrimination, and all of this, they don't say it, but these are inconvenient truths. They don't want to be really involved with those inconvenient truths. They want to keep their status as is, right? Now move to Black Lives Matter. The same people who won't speak out about widespread atrocities against, whichever community within India, it's very easy to look far away and say, look, we are progressive because we really are against racism and racial discrimination, because it's not affecting us. Just as those Hillary Clinton supporting women who hate Muslims and don't think caste discrimination exists, it was in some ways distancing themselves from a place. So this simultaneous, being majorities in some place and speaking from that perspective, or being minorities in one place but claiming your majority perspective from another location, that's exactly what makes people, it's very easy to join an international brigade saying Black Lives Matter, and it's equally difficult to actually act on exactly those same structural circumstances close to home and do something about it. That'll actually cost you some in terms of your energy, your money, maybe your celebrity status or what have you. Doing something about it versus providing a lip service to I support that is very evident through this intersectional frame. That you are trying to exist in two places and you're trying to maintain your privileges the best you can in multiple spaces. And so what you support and what you don't support just becomes part of it.
Right. I think we've come towards the end of the interview. I think I can speak on behalf of both of us that it was just sheer joy listening to you. I have never known and learned and actually, applied intersectionality in such ways. We learned so much about the historical as well as the contemporary and the application of the framework. Ma'am, do you have any suggestions, or would you like to say anything to, budding sociologists or researchers working on this particular concept?
The thing that I want to say is, it doesn't make sense to work really hard to make intersectionality a pure theory. I think intersectionality always has to remain a particular approach that weaves many strands of theories together, but it has to be at the heart of your analysis that makes people pay heed to the voices and experiences of the people that we are studying, like very seriously ask them. You talked about the COVID crisis. I gave you my view. If you were studying that, you shouldn't take my view. You should first ask people, what is it that you experience? But then as scholars, you know the histories, you know the structures. They might not be able to point all of those out to you, but you begin to unpack and dismantle and look at the bigger picture, and your analyses should be, made robust because you're looking at multiple issues that you're aware of. And so to budding researchers, that's what I would say. Interrogate your analyses all the time to ask, have I, sufficiently paid respect to the people who I'm studying by actually asking them whatever they want to say, getting beyond what they think I want to hear, but actually asking them, but also bringing your knowledge of a larger history, a larger framework, and the privileges you have to be able to talk about the things that perhaps they couldn't talk about, and work it into your research. Because if you don't, you already know their voices are erased. That's part of the marginalization. So would you create research agendas and frameworks that's actually respectful of the people you're trying to work with, and find out about their lives and study their lives, but are you also going to be hypercritical of the structures that get normalized so often, so that the way they experience the structures becomes very evident through your writing and really through everything that you do? So that's pretty much what I would like to say.
Okay. Thank you so much again for the interview. It was a privilege to have you here. Thank you so much from the Doing Sociology team.
You're welcome.